One of the interesting things about Casement is that there's so many different views about him. About, for a long time there was a debate whether or not he was gay because he was outed by the British Secret Service in 1916, just before his execution. So there's lots of conspiracy theories until really the early noughties, maybe even 2010, about that. I think now it's pretty settled, but still there's two major biographers of Casement who are always arguing with each other and saying to each other they've got the wrong take on him. One's called there. If you go to an Irish bookshop, you'll probably find a book by either one of them. There's Geoffrey Dudgeon and Angus something or other. And it was a frustrating thing when I was doing all the research for this because all the biographers really disagree with each other. I thought, well, not let's have a bit of fun when I'm actually making it and not try and be realistic. Um, and not try and present it as if it is, the authoritative voice of Roger Casement. Because one of the fun things about comics is that you can't pretend it's real life because it's obviously a drawing. So, unlike a movie where you cast real people and actors and you kind of give it a facade of realism, there's no such thing in comics. And then you add the text on top of that. So, with a drawing, there's this veneer of not veneer, but there's this unreality of it and disconnection, kind of the simile you would get from puppetry actually as well, rather than animation. So throughout the book, if anyone's read it, it's partially narrated by Casement himself, but in a kind of detached way, as if he's kind of narrating his own memoirs. Um, and kind of like being playful and giving this kind of playful voice where he's trying to like rewrite his own history. So it starts with him. He's trying to sail to the west of Ireland with a boat full of guns, which is sunk by like a British warship. So he's swimming up to the shore of Ireland with a lot of sodden guns that don't work, and he's trying to think to himself about how to describe this in his memoirs. Like, oh, it was a beautiful day and the sun was rising in the east, but the war was setting in the west. And then he's like swimming and thinking, oh, this isn't a great metaphor, but I'll have time to correct this before it goes to press. I'll have time to like write my story properly and just kind of riffing on it as it goes along. And I was having a lot of fun when I was making about thinking of different visual devices for kind of contrasting the few, the relatively small amount of proper documentary evidence of Casement in his life and the things that he did with the way I was drawing him as a character. So in this section, it's it's some of the text is taken from the account of one of the police officers who arrested him, which is unreliable because that police officer was interested in like puffing up his own kind of legacy. And interesting, that police officer was also, I think, arrested for trying to solicit like a minor in Hyde Park, like in the 1920s. So it's kind of contrasting like my version of Casement with these like drawn versions of photos from the Boer War in the I think the early 1900s, and contrasting the different types of visual styles with it. Overall, though, like it's kind of the experience to make that has really informed my teaching because I only had like 6 months to make that graphic novel. Well, actually, a wee bit more than that, but it was a really intensive period of creation, and also it was quite it was a lot shorter than I ideally wanted it to be. So it came out at 120 pages, and I had enough kind of research material to fill about 300. But then that's the kind of sacrifices you have to make if you want to actually produce something that's out there. There's whole loads of, drawings and storyboards that are still sitting in a box somewhere that I could go back to, but I don't think anyone would actually want to, you know, put an appendix onto that of the rest of Casement's life. So my other experiments with narrative nonfiction include, get my timer up again. So this is a couple of short pieces I did for an anthology that was to celebrate the centenary of women's suffrage. So this is another figure in Irish history who's really interesting, but she doesn't have the kind of neat narrative arc Casement has, because Casement was executed in 1916 just after he was convicted of treason and also outed publicly as a gay man. Whereas Bernadette Devlin is still alive, and she hasn't had like a heroic end because she's still out there fighting for basically socialist causes and kind of justice in Northern Ireland. And Northern Ireland doesn't have like a heroic end either. Northern Ireland's still kind of it's still kind of a big mess, really. So her like there's a period in her life that makes a really good story, but it doesn't have that kind of like conclusion to it. Um, so this is just a one-page piece on her kind of short rise to fame as part of the civil rights movement in Northern Ireland, and the time that she slapped the Home Secretary in the face in Parliament. She was at the time the youngest person elected to Parliament. She came into Parliament the weekend or the week after Bloody Sunday in Derry, and the Home Secretary Maudsley had denied that the British soldiers had shot and Bernadette Devlin crossed the floor and slapped him in the face. And then asked afterwards, I think she said she just wished she'd hit him harder. Um, and then this next piece was like a three-pager on Jessica Mitford, the independent journalist. And she also had a great narrative to her life, where she went from like an aristocrat she didn't have any formal schooling to being a muckraking journalist and an active member of the Communist Party in America. And she ran away during the Spanish Civil War while her sister Diana married the leader of the Fascist Party of the United Kingdom, and her sister Unity stalked Hitler in Germany. And there's a really interesting graphic novel about the Mitfords out recently by an American author that is really worth a read. So this is another example of trying to condense like a period of a life down to something really short and digestible, almost like making a movie pitch from or making like an elevator pitch of a life by condensing it down to 4 pages. Let's check what time we're at. And then there's some other things I'm experimenting with, like trying to experiment with just different. I'm really influenced by Linda Barry and also really influenced by the Crazy Cat comic book from the 1910s and the different ways that they would lay things out on a page. Like Crazy Cat, if you haven't read it, was really experimental and it's a great funny comic. But he did different layouts in the page all the time. And I was trying to experiment with this and also trying to experiment a bit with color. And this is almost like an illustrated kind of visual essay where I was listening. It was back in 2019 in the first Trump administration. And I was listening to the news about Brett Kavanaugh being appointed to the US Supreme Court and thinking about, the role of women in society and thinking about that song in My Fair Lady, Why Can't a Woman Be More Like a Man? And trying to figure out how can I put this in like a visual essay kind of thing that also talks a little bit about my great grandmother who was a wife, a daughter, a mother, a worker, she actually worked in a shop that sold Bibles and things like that. I think she had 8 kids, but also was a playwright and wrote and produced plays through her entire life as well, at the same time as parenting like multiple children, and whose work, as far as I know, it has not survived. It was put into the attic of their old house, and when the house was demolished, I think, just went all with it. It made me think of, all the things that like unacknowledged work that women like basically people who aren't straight men do that isn't preserved. It's kind of lost to history. And this is another thing I like imaginary piece inspired by Little Nemo in Slumberland about kind of going back in time and showing my great grandmother an alternative future where she gets to have her plays performed at the Abbey in Dublin. Uh, and also, as well as making comics, I write about comics a bit too. So if anyone's also really interested in the X-Men, I wrote something about the character of Rogue and the concept of hysteria and a very masculine, very like male fantasy way in which, if anyone's not aware of the X-Men, Rogue can't touch anyone because she absorbs the memories and powers of whoever she touches. And that's always phrased until very recently as like, oh, it means she can't like have, heterosexual sex, when there's a whole lot more to that being unable to being able to touch people than heterosexual sex. I could, write about the X-Men for years. It's just like it's my pet kind of like obsession along with just making comics. And I should have an article in the Journal of Illustration out later this year that is about kind of making comics that are about challenging and uncomfortable narratives, but trying to, it's really about the choices I made when making the Roger Casement graphic novel about, how can I address his work in the Congo and Peru without making it like a side story in one white man's heroic narrative, which is like a really complicated decision-making process. Actually, more so now than it was then, because I've been thinking a lot back on it and thinking, well, could I not have, why did I exclude all of that? So it's a lot of like kind of painful compromises you have to make when you're dealing with like real person's life and all the different kind of like aspects of all the different things it touches upon and condensing other people's stories into like sidelines in another person's life, which is also feeding into what I'm working at the minute, which I'm trying to develop a graphic novel about OCD. And not just like my own experience about OCD, but thinking of OCD kind of overall. If anyone's familiar with Forney's Marbles, that's what I'm kind of thinking of structuring it like. It's not just about her own personal experience of bipolar disorder. It's also about bipolar disorder and kind of neurodiverse creativity in general. She uses a lot of really interesting, almost like diagrammatic illustrations in it. And also, if anyone's read, oop, yeah, the Icon books introducing guide are also great examples of how to communicate like more scientific or more complicated literature with illustrations. This one, um, this one is really interesting because it goes into a lot of really bizarre science about the brain. And the person Oscar Zarate, who illustrated it, has is a comic book illustrator and has made graphic novels with Self-Made Hero. So a lot of my research so far has gone is thinking about like why is your brain like really illogical? So if you don't know about OCD, OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. And a big thing about it, but not the only thing, is intrusive and uncomfortable thoughts that they're called ego dystonic. So you really don't want to have them. You're disgusted that you have them. And you get into this loop of thinking, why am I having this thought? Do I want to have it? Does this mean do I want to murder people? I don't want to murder people. And it can be about anything. So a lot of people, the typical presentation is about germs and cleanliness. Um, but it's really, I think the term is heterogeneous. So it can really be about anything. Apparently, it's very culture and like time dependent as well. So a lot of young people presenting now have this contamination fear, but it's about microplastics, and they're going to kind of extreme lengths to shield themselves from microplastics. Um, for some people, they have this kind of fear that they've run someone over with their car. But the funny thing about OCD is that because it is so diverse and the things that people tag onto, when you've been in a support group, and I actually went to there's an inpatient unit at Bethlehem down in London, and I was talking to the people in there, and they use a lot of humor to and art therapy to kind of get as applied therapy for OCD. And we're talking about, isn't it really funny that like what you're scared of, I think it's ridiculous, and what I'm scared of, you think is ridiculous. And they actually made loads of like little Christmas ornaments for their Christmas tree when I visited that was, writing things like 666 down and sticking on a tree. And they have a statue that has a toilet seat around its neck and has like bottles of Domestos in his hands and has like 666 carved on it and penises everywhere. So also thinking about how do you illustrate this? How do you explain how the really illogical way your brain works, where you know that what you're thinking about doesn't matter, but you just can't get the fear out of your head. But how do you also kind of make it ridiculous that, you can look at it and think, oh, actually, this is really stupid. This is really stupid, and I don't need to be scared of it anymore. Um, so yeah, some of that it's still very much in the developmental process, and I have reams and reams and reams of literature that I've read about it. I'm still trying to catch up with other people's kind of like the different comics about it that I find, like this one, Everything in Its Emergency, and these are all samples of comics that are in the Welcome collection, like small press things. I'm still trying to figure out like how do I tell this in a way that's not just about my own personal story, but more about what Ellen Forney was doing in Marbles, where this is kind of about this I'm one example, but this is how your mind works. This is how we understand how your mind works and how it, in the case of OCD, malfunctions. And I want a bit of like fun with it as well. Like people, you're actually not a freak. It's just everyone's brain is a bit weird. And there's just some good like strategies for dealing with it, with maybe laughter and exposure. Um, okay, so I think that's my time up.
Hello everyone, I'm Bruna Martini and I am a published author of graphic novels. I work between Italy, where I'm from, and the UK, where I have been living for the past 15 years. So I'm going to share my presentation now. Here we go. I have created four long-form graphic novels and more recently a number of short graphic stories and poems published in UK magazines both online and in print. And tonight I wanted to talk about the question that is behind my body of work and that I have been obsessed with for the last 2 decades. And I wonder if you have been asking this yourself as well. Have you ever felt like your life was shaped before you were even born? This is something that has really intrigued me. And I try to answer this question by making graphic memoirs as a way of exploring lives through a historical and historiographic lens. I focus on lives that are very small, lives I'm familiar with, lives within my own family. I usually start small and then things get bigger and bigger and bigger and they connect to other interesting phenomena and topics. My first book is Patria, Crescere in tempo di guerra, which translates to Motherland, growing up in war times. And it was published in 2021 by Italian publisher Becco Giallo. It was included among the best 5 graphic novels published that year, and it received an official commendation from the President of Italy for its anti-fascist content. The scribble you see on the right, it is not my 3-year-old writing, but it's actually the handwriting of the President of Italy, and it took me probably 2 days to decipher what he had said. In Patria, I start small, as I said. I focus on the memory of war of my aunt, who is 94 this year, but she was just a child during the fascist regime. So I started from my aunt's experience in fascist primary schools, and her story became a point of entry into a broader exploration of propaganda under fascism, how ideology is absorbed in everyday life, how it is taught, normalized, and even internalized from a very young age. So what initially appears as a small personal memory reveals itself as a part of a much wider historical mechanism. I continued this line of inquiry in Roots, where I investigated the story of another ancestor of mine, this dashing gentleman, Granco Cornelio Rondelli, who lived between 1890s and 1950s. He was my great-grandmother's older brother, and he left Italy in the 1910s in very mysterious circumstances. And when I say mysterious, I mean no one in the family knew why he had left. Not his sisters, not his brother, not his parents, nobody knew why he suddenly left Italy and never came back. So I love a good detective story, and I couldn't let that go. I spent the next few years looking for any information I could to try and piece together the fragments of this story. So I visited archives, libraries, museums. I did a lot of genealogic research and quite a bit of online stalking as well, I'm gonna be honest. And I found out that my ancestor had left Italy to move to Argentina, where he created a really big family. And I was able to put together the family tree and then even to get reconnected to my Argentinian branch of the family. Until the beginning of the project, I didn't know I had any relatives in South America. That was news to me. So I traveled down to Cordoba in the northern part of Argentina, and I met Marta and Italo, the two only surviving children of a family of 10. And they had a really rich collection of photographs, maps, documents that helped me understand what their father was. But it didn't just reconstruct that specific individual life. It kind of made me feel how it was to be a migrant person from Europe in the early 20th century in a completely different place. So I developed what I called a graphic history approach, where the archival sources are really the storytellers. In making my graphic novel, I didn't want to do what is called historical revisionism. I didn't want to insert my own voice as someone born a century later with different values and cultural references. No, I wanted the sources to speak for themselves. And my aim was to immerse the viewer as fully as possible in the reality that my ancestor inhabited. I did that not only to talk about Italian immigration, which obviously is a very important phenomenon and helped understand many characteristics of my country, but I also wanted to talk about the innate part of human nature of travel around, look for a better future, discover, learn. The objects in my graphic novel are used sometimes as references. Um, so, for example, here I looked at posters and postcards and recreated outfits and hairdos quite accurately. But most of the time, the handmade pastel and watercolor illustrations are combined with historical sources. So I scanned the documents, I put them in my drawings through the technique of the collage. And whilst I was making this book, I realized that somewhere along the way, the project had become more personal than I expected. I realized that Gracco was not the only person in the family who had emigrated. There was me as well. So he had left Italy to look for something elsewhere, and so had I. So my interest in him wasn't purely historical. It was sort of a way of investigating myself and understanding myself as well. Because truth is, I left Italy quite young, and now I don't fully feel at home anywhere. I exist somewhere at the intersections of cultures and languages. I am not fully English in the UK because I don't have the same cultural references and my accent just give it away. But when I go back home, I'm also not fully Italian. In fact, some of my relatives call me the English one. Um, so I am an outsider looking in, and the sense of displacement has become a bit part of my work. So I decided that my practice, well, I would say my practice naturally started to shift a little bit inward, to turn inward to my everyday. A few years ago, I had a child and everything changed overnight. I mean, mostly my sleep schedule, of course, but mainly my entire sense of self. I suddenly felt like I had no time, no mental space, and honestly, no idea what I could say as an artist anymore. I was even wondering, am I an artist? What should I talk about? My days were just filled with very repetitive, unglamorous tasks. So, what I was even going to talk about maybe nappies or breastfeeding, but no one would want to hear about that. And then I thought, well, actually, why not? Exactly that. I will talk about exactly that. I will focus on my everyday experience of motherhood and tell it how it is. Because motherhood is rarely shown as it actually is. It's either idealized or turned into some kind of instruction manual. So I wanted to talk about it as it really feels. Funny, sometimes tender, very overwhelming, exhausting, all at once. So for example, here I focused on breastfeeding, which is a real bitch. It's really hard. It doesn't work just like that. And it creates a lot of problems to the mind and to the body. Then magic, when it starts working, breastfeeding can be amazing, but it's not automatic. Yet everyone, oh, breastfeeding, such an easy, innate, natural joy, figure it out. So I just wanted to pick all these contradictions and stereotypes and prejudice and put them on paper. Let's see this one, for example. When you see a mom, silence. That's just what it is. If you see a dad, oh my God, you look cute with your baby. Daughters always prefer their dads. Good for you to help mom out. So I decided to continue this type of work and created a story for Fictionable, which will be published mid-April. And it's called One Day at a Time, because who wouldn't want to imagine a life where you could go in the main book chain shops and just take all these perfect parenting instruction manuals and destroy them all and just write over them your personal view of motherhood or parenthood in general. If you wanted to find out whether I've been facing any charge because of my graffiti spree, well then head on the Fictionable website and read the story. I also created a short 4-page story called How to Make a Parent, which is going to be included in volume 5 from Boxes. And I try to offer a version of motherhood that feels a bit more honest, something people might recognize, laugh at, and hopefully feel slightly less alone in. But unfortunately, alongside life and babies and birth, there is also loss. Last year, I lost my mother to cancer, and that experience has deeply shaped my recent work, both in topic and in format and style. I have found that I cannot create anything else at the moment. I can only write about this and draw about this. My comics have really started to shift into what I think of as graphic poems, where text and image merge much more closely. Because, you know, sometimes words are not enough, but images are not enough either. So the way I place the text within the images is really important to bring up some emotions and create meaning. I published this week in AC's Weekly, the online comic magazine from V for Vendetta illustrator David Lloyd. It's been published in episodes, but now it's available to buy as part of volume 78. You just need to go on their website. I explore grief in its different forms, how it comes and goes, how it changes shape, how it quietly stays with you. The way the words and images sit on the page becomes part of that very expression. And it comes in wave, I reflect on what it means to become a mother while losing your own mother. So how those two experiences, beginning and ending, can exist at the same time. It's a bit of an emotional roller coaster, so of course I decided to create a comic about it. And there will be a Kickstarter launching in May, so you can have a look at Third Bear Press Instagram to find more about it. To conclude, just wanted to highlight how across all of my work there is a continuous thread, how seemingly small everyday experiences connect to something much bigger. So it could be migration, like my ancestor. It could be going to school during fascist times. It could be become a mother or losing one. Lives are, yes, every day, but they're not ordinary. They are always part of a bigger story, and even the most everyday moments can carry extraordinary weight. So I hope that you enjoyed this chat, and if you want to find out a bit more about my graphic books or stories or poems, just have a look at my website and my Instagram. It would be nice to continue our chat there. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to stop sharing.
Hello, everybody. Everybody sitting on your sofa or making dinner or ready for bed. That's usually me at LDComics. But this time I'm very honoured to be speaking, so thank you. Yeah, I'm Myfanwy Tristram, but most people call me Myf. If you call me Myfanwy, I will probably assume that you've just sent me a spam email and won't bother to look at it. Next slide, please, Fionnuala.
Nope.
Yeah, so my graphic novel Noisy Valley is coming out with Self-Made Hero on May the 14th. And I thought I'd just take this time to talk about the practicalities of making it, because I know the LDC audience is mostly comics makers yourself. So here's a quick rundown. I'm going to tell you what the graphic novel is, why I made it, how it came about, but then I'm going to make some tips for anyone else who's interested in making this sort of documentary comic. And then right at the end, I'm going to share with you a couple of dreadful mistakes that I made in the hope that nobody else has to make them. Next slide, please. Yeah, so first of all, just to explain what Noisy Valley is, in effect, it's a collection of interviews with people who live in the Rhondda Valley area of South Wales. And if you've never heard of the Rhondda Valley, I have to admit, it hadn't really registered much on my consciousness before this project either. The opening spread explains a bit more. Next slide. So I will read this out. It says, in the south of Wales, just 16 miles north of Cardiff, the capital, you will find the Rhondda Valley. Many sources state that the word Rhondda means noisy. Well, that's what Wikipedia says, although it does then continue, this is a simplified translation without much research. But you know what? I'll go with it. Because when I visited the Rhondda, what I found, and what you're about to see, is that this little part of South Wales, best known to the rest of the UK if it comes to mind at all, for striking miners, terraced houses, and steep-sided mountains, can certainly get noisy. And actually, talking of miners' strikes and mountains and terraced houses, I guess for a lot of people, the touch point for the Rhondda Valley is the movie Pride, which you may have seen. Next slide, please. So I'm calling this a documentary comic, which is where I can see a crossover with both your work, Fionnuala, and yours, Bruna. It's based on real life stories told to me by real people, and these are just some of them. Next slide, please. So obviously I'm not the first person to have had this idea of a documentary comic, and anyone who's heard me speak before has probably already heard me rhapsodize about people like Olivier Cuglé, my absolute hero. So the page that you can see here is from his Fish and Chips series, where he was interviewing people at every stage of the fish and chips food chain. So starting with the fishermen, ending with the people who actually run fish and chip shops, and cleverly smuggling in, but never actually overtly saying, I don't think, that, you know, this most British of foods only comes to us through the efforts of people who have come from elsewhere, so immigrants who have come to this country. Next slide, please. Another great influence, Julia Rothman. I don't know if you've seen her work. She's an illustrator working out of New York. She used to do this column for the New York Times where every week she would go and talk to people and then draw it up in a strip. And I want her job. I want to be the UK Julia Rothman. I'm just saying that, manifesting it to make it happen. So, for example, what you can see here is she spent the night in a bodega, so a little corner shop, interviewing every customer that came in right through the night to find out why they were there, what they were buying, and then she drew it up. Another one that she did around Christmas time, she went and spoke to all the people who were selling Christmas trees on the corner of New York streets and finding out how on earth they had ended up in this strange job and getting all the background of that. And it's all really fascinating. And I think what it taught me is that no subject is too small. Next slide. And then finally, this is David Ziggy Green. He did a column for Private Eye for many years, where he would just go and sort of see something that was happening, whether it was a village fete or in this case, a big protest, and he would draw everything that he saw. So it was sort of reportage comics, I suppose you would call it. Next slide, please. So going back to Noisy Valley, my own graphic novel, how did it come about? Well, a few years ago, I was invited down to exhibit my pictures of protest in a small local gallery. And I guess this is an example of what a self-directed project can do for you. Nobody had asked me to draw these pictures. It was an Inktober exercise that I'd set myself, and I'd just done it for its own sake. Next slide. And so these pictures had caught the eye of a gallery in South Wales called The Workers, and they got in touch and asked if they could exhibit them. And I thought, well, while I'm down there, I'll ask local people, just for something to do, I'll ask local people to tell me their memories of protest, which I would then draw up in a comic. And so here are some of the topics that people told me about. Next slide. So Aldermaston, I heard from a photographer who had photographed the Aldermaston anti-nuclear marches way back in the 50s and 60s. And he had some really interesting stories to tell about that. Next slide. One woman told me about visiting the Greenham Women Peace Camp and the extraordinary effect that that had had on her outlook of the world, having grown up in quite a small community in the valleys. Suddenly, her horizons were expanded, and she said that it really changed her view of what it was to be a woman, and there were women of all types there. Next slide. Patrick, he was a poet who had organised local protests against the pollution that was coming about through a waste processing plant in the valley. Next slide. And Jenny, she's a retired lady, and she's part of a group protesting against the development of ancient meadowland. So I heard about all sorts of different protests, ones that were happening in the moment, ones that people remembered from decades back. And everybody had a really fascinating tale to tell. And, my belief really is that everyone has a fascinating tale to tell if you just listen. Next slide. So by the end of my time there, I had a set of 12 interviews. And then around these, I've put my story of actually visiting the Rhondda and the gallery and my reaction to this absolutely extraordinary landscape, meeting people who run this absolutely extraordinary gallery. That's fine. Yeah, forward, one forward. That's it. Thank you. Yeah, and then so right at the end, by the time I had found an agent and I was working with her, the wonderful Corinne Perlman, at her suggestion, I pulled it all together by adding some pages about protest more broadly. So I suppose her point was, yes, it's all very well focusing in on this one little local community, but why would people read it outside the community? How can you convince people that it has wider relevance? So these pages explain the current legislation around protest, both here and around the world, and how governments everywhere are cracking down on our rights to protest. And so overall, the book tries to reframe protest from something that's undesirable and illegal, which is what the government seem to want people to believe now, and show the other side of protest, which is that it can be creative and joyful and actually quite essential. And I think, you know, when you look at things like Greenham, Aldermaston, these have become historic set pieces, and we hold them up and go, how wonderful. But then in the same breath, we might look at people who are protesting for today's issues and go, oh, those dreadful people, they need to keep their mouths shut. Next slide. Yeah, so that's Noisy Valley. And then I'm quickly going to run through a few tips if you are interested in making a comic like this. So the first tip, choose a topic. As I say, I think everything is interesting if you look at it with enough curiosity. So for example, is there a campaign group in your area that would be interesting to talk to? Or even a set of shops, you could interview the shopkeepers. Is something about to change? Because if so, by interviewing people now, you could be recording a slice of history for the future. And it literally could be as simple as just interviewing everybody who lives on your street and finding out one interesting fact about each of them. Next slide. If you're trying to speak to or for a community, you might find that you have to be trusted first. So I was really lucky to have my way into the Rhondda. This was a totally new area for me, but the gallery itself had been there for many years and they were very trusted by the community. They'd put in extremely hard work to get to that stage. Otherwise, you know, I'm not sure that people would have taken very kindly to somebody from Brighton just swanning in and demanding their stories. So you might have to approach a community leader, go to a meeting, you might have to explain what's in it for them. And it might just be enough to say you'll be in a wonderful comic. It's going to be a lovely work of art. But if they're a campaign or maybe a group of misunderstood people, equally they might benefit from new audiences and an increased level of understanding from your readers. Next slide. I would advise to work out what you want to ask people first, but at the same time be prepared to listen in case the conversation goes off in interesting angles. And I used a transcription app called Otter, which meant that I had all the interviews in writing afterwards and I could edit them down. So it really didn't matter how long people went on. Sort of better to have too much so that you can edit it down than working with just a little bit of material. Next slide. I think it's good to whittle down though. You have to be quite ruthless. So you want to keep to the story that serves your aims. So for me, I knew I wanted to write about the value of protest. And so reluctantly, I did cut out quite a lot of interesting stories and what would have been lovely content, but it just didn't speak to the theme. So for example, that photographer who went to Aldermaston, he was telling me all about how he became a photographer, what cameras he used to use, you know, what it was like in swinging London in the 60s, but none of it made the final cut, unfortunately. Next slide. Just a practical point, while you're talking to people, then it's really good if you can take photographs of them, obviously with their permission, from many angles, because in the course of a conversation, you'll be drawing lots and lots of panels and you soon get bored of just drawing head and shoulders. So if you only get a few photographs, you could also ask them if they've got photos, especially if they're talking about something that happened decades ago. You might want photos of their younger selves as well. Next slide. Make sure that you get to authorization of everything. So you need to keep your subjects informed of every step. So I work with words first. So I would write the script and I would pass the script back to the subjects first before I started drawing. And that was for me much better because it meant if they wanted to change anything, it was at that stage before I'd sort of invested all my time and effort into the drawing. So yeah, I would advise to do something similar. Next slide. And then keep people updated. So a graphic novel is a very long project. your subjects might wonder what's happening if you just go off and you're drawing for years on end. So let them know now and again. You know, for example, when I got a publisher, I let them all know. And also partly because, you know, they'd signed up to a small sort of self-published comic. They hadn't necessarily signed off international release of a graphic novel. So that was a gentle way just to let them know that that was happening as well. Invite them to the launch, give them a free copy. These things are really important because without those people, your project wouldn't exist. Next slide, please. So now I'm just quickly going to look at the process. So I draw digitally, and I've been self-publishing comics for years and years now. So there are things that I do know very well, like keeping a high resolution for physical printing. Next slide. And leaving a gutter and a margin, making it CMYK rather than RGB. Fionnuala, can we flick back between this slide and the next one, please?
Yeah.
Back and forth a little bit.
Oh,
yeah, that's
okay.
it. Thank you. Yeah. So this was just to show, and do you want to go back to the previous and then forward to that one? Yeah. Thank you. This was just to show how I positioned the speech balloons so that they don't fall in that middle gutter. So if you look at the picture itself, you might not notice particularly, but once you see those two areas of purple, you can see that deliberately I've tried to place it so that nothing disappears into the gutter. Next slide. Yeah, so this is how I would make a page. First I would write the script, then I would do the thumbnails. I started off drawing pencils on paper, scanning them in, and then doing the digital drawings over the top. But towards the end, I think I just got so used to the digital interface that effectively I was sort of penciling a rough sketch digitally and then putting a new layer on top and doing the inks. So there are actually no paper pencils towards the end. Next slide. Yeah, so this is what I would do. I'd put all the lettering in first so that I knew the pictures could fit around it. And next slide. Yeah, that's just to show how the pictures then slot in. So all of that I was very comfortable with. I had no problem preparing all these pages. Those are the things that I did right, but there were just a couple of things that came back to bite me. Next slide. So one minor thing was I did not know that text in a book, in a graphic novel, should be solid black. And I had chosen this navy blue to match the drawing colour. And apparently this is to do with how the ink can get a bit fuzzy in the printing process if it's not pure black. Don't ask me any questions about that. I'm not, don't really know the technicalities of that, and I'm not an expert. So this was a bit of a pain to fix, but it wasn't the end of the world because the publisher actually, towards the end, had sent me their style sheet. So I was already having to go through every page. So for example, one of the things that Self-Made Hero like is for words like realise or specialise to end in a Z, I-Z-E rather than an I-S-E, which is actually the opposite of the style guide at my day job. So I had to get my head around that. But I was just going through page by page anyway, so that was fine. I could change the text to black at that stage. Next slide. Okay, this is where it all went really wrong. So I made the book in a program called Affinity Photo, which I really recommend for most cases. So it's brilliant in so many ways. And when I was self-publishing, it really served me well. It does everything you need it to. It's extremely similar to Photoshop, with the one important difference that instead of tying you into a massive monthly subscription, well, at the time you just paid a one-off, I think it was about 35 quid, and now it's bundled in with Canva, so it's actually free. So made the book, happily exported all my pages very cleverly. You can see on the right there, got all my layers. So my text was on one layer, or several layers actually, one for each bit of text. My images were on another layer. And sent them off to my agent and my editor so that she could help me do a final polish before we handed it all over to Self-Made Hero. All well within deadline, brilliant. And this is where we discovered that even though I could export the images with the layers intact, we couldn't edit the layers in Adobe InDesign, which apparently is the industry standard software. And that's what Self-Made Hero use. Next slide. And this was important for a couple of reasons. Number one, Self-Made Hero's designer goes through and very cleverly fixes little areas like this where the text is a bit too close to the edge of a speech bubble. I'm a bit cavalier with my speech bubbles and I can never get them looking nice, but he was able to sort of extend or decrease the width of letters to a very, very fine degree, but he couldn't do that because these layers weren't editable. And the other important reason is in case in the future they ever want to translate the book, they will need to just hand over the whole package to an international publisher who would be able to expect to go into each layer and put the translated text in there. So basically, Adobe is a walled garden. We tried everything we could think of and none of it worked. So in the end, I had to spend 2 solid weeks copying and pasting all the text out of my pages onto a Google Doc, and then deleting the text from those pages and then pasting it back in InDesign. And in the 3 years of making this book, this was the only moment that I actually cried. I had a cold, it was no fun at all, I was working to deadline. And my husband saw me and he went, well, there is one solution. I went, what? He went, well, you could give up. I went, well, I'm not giving up now. Like, I've come so far. This is the final hurdle after all these years of work. You know, I've been spending every weekend drawing, before work every day. I just needed to get it over this final hurdle. And in the end, we did. Next slide. So, no blood, no sweat, but there were definitely a few tears that went into this. Those are all my best tips and a little bit about Noisy Valley. It is available now for pre-order, so if you are interested in that, I would be delighted. And pre-orders apparently really help because it shows the bookshop that there's demand and then they'll get more in. Next slide. This is the very first time that I've talked about Noisy Valley in the run-up to its publication. I've got a load of dates lined up, so it'd be lovely to see any of you at any of these, and the details are all on my website, myfanwytristram.com. And next slide, last slide. Yeah, finally, just to say that I mentor through LDC as well, and I do have spots coming up soon. It's been like a real surprising amount of joy to me to talk through people's projects and learn all about their comics and give what advice I can. So yeah, just to say that's an available service if that's of any interest. Thank you very much.